The Victorian era, from 1837 to 1901, in Britain, was a period of profound change. It had a fascination with both technology and the supernatural, fueled by advancements in science and technology, which led to a paradoxical blend of skepticism and belief that laid the foundation for modern paranormal studies. This era, in fact, gave birth to paranormal research. It saw the birth of the first real paranormal group, the Society for Psychical Research, or SPR, which sought to investigate the paranormal with scientific rigor. The society was started in 1882 in London. We're going to look at the 11 most interesting cases from its first 4 years. Scientific curiosity about the paranormal was not seen as something unworthy of analytical inquiry by the many distinguished Oxford and Cambridge graduates who made up the society, but a new frontier that science could come to understand, categorize, and conquer intellectually. To this end, they collected their cases into their groundbreaking book, Phantasms of the Living. The 11 cases we're going to look at are taken from that book, which represent the fruits of the SPR's first 4 years. They approach the topic methodically, categorizing the experiences based on perceived credibility. Single witnesses of the paranormal were almost always assumed hallucinations, until proven otherwise, and it was only if another person was involved, or if some impossible knowledge was displayed, that they were put into the as yet unproven category of a reciprocal case or a collective case, in which case it warranted further investigation. If you read this 730-page book like we did, you'd probably find it a bit cold and clinical. Yet, at the same time, it's that scientific and skeptical approach, that intellectual credibility that makes you want to read further, knowing only the truest of the true tales are going to make it through these guys' powerful cognitive radar to detect the Victorian equivalent of fake news. You will, however, end up finding some truly memorable paranormal tales if you examine it thoroughly enough. We scoured the book for the best 11 tales it contains, so you don't have to. These tales have been forgotten and neglected for maybe 100 years, cleverly hidden in the endless dry words of a lengthy Victorian tome. And so we're dragging them out into the light of modern day and giving them a new lease on life right here, today. Let's start with 3 of the most typical types of stories from this book. The first story is related by a sailor, who, sailing in 1862 to Bombay, had a presentiment of doom for the whole voyage. He just knew he'd get some bad news during the voyage, a so-called black letter relating some tragedy. However, they headed back home and reached as far as St. Helena with no bad news. 2 days after leaving St. Helena, he was up aloft doing some trifling sailor's work with the 4th officer on the mizzen topsail when he heard a bell begin to toll. The other sailors seemed to hear nothing, but it was so loud to him that he immediately ran to the 2 ship's bells to see if they were making the noise. He even touched them to determine if they were vibrating, but they were as still and silent as could be, both of them. He scanned the horizon in search of a sail, but saw none. Realizing now that this was something supernatural, he gave his shipmate a resigned look and said, "That is my black letter." When their ship got to the port of Falmouth, he discovered that a much-beloved lady who was like an older sister to him had passed away during his voyage. She was only 29, but his aunt by marriage, and he adored her with all his heart. She had always playfully called him her young sailor love, as her husband, the uncle, was her old sailor love. Her final goodbye to her young sailor love at the moment of her death left a permanent impression on the young man. "For," he said, years later, "after nearly 25 years I can still remember the boom of that bell." The second tale is about 2 girls, half Italian, half English. One with a very fine voice. This girl somehow became afflicted in her throat and started to suddenly hemorrhage from her mouth. Far away, in Italy, the other sister suddenly heard her sister calling from the garden, outside, "Georgie, Georgie, I must see you before I die." The girl in Italy, named Georgie, became desperate and frantic to go to her sister, in England. But it couldn't be done so easily. Soon, a letter came announcing that her sister had passed away. Further inquiries revealed that her last moments were at exactly the same time the voice was heard, in Italy, and that her final words had been exactly the same words heard in the garden, "I must see you before I die." Third, in 1878, a man was walking across Tavistock Square, in London, with a middle-aged nurse walking behind him. They entered the park, and all was deserted and quiet. A man suddenly appeared, young and ghastly pale. He was dressed in evening clothes, of foreign appearance. Tall and slim, he walked with long measured strides, noiselessly, without a sound. He wore a strange tall top hat and eyeglass. The moonbeams, falling on the corpse-like features, revealed a face well known to the man, that of a friend and relative. The maid walking behind him stopped abruptly, as if spellbound by this apparition, his face now upturned towards the heavens and smiling ghastly. She seemed dazed with confusion at first, but then ran away with a shriek and at a speed remarkable for her age. A week later, he finally got the news that on that strange morning, this friend and relative had, indeed, passed away. According to the rites of his Greek church and the custom of the country he had resided in, he was buried in his evening clothes, made by a foreign tailor. He had never seen his friend wear an eyeglass before, but then he learned, later, that he had begun to do so just a few months before his end. Do you see a pattern yet? One thing that makes this book a bit of a dry read is that 90% of the cases are like this. Most are about a Victorian gentleman or lady having a prediction of a family member or loved one dying and then seeing or hearing something supernatural right at the moment when that person died. Guess that kind of thing was pretty common in Victorian times. Here too, we've read them all and selected the best of this type, to save you time. So, we started our night of Victorian ghost stories with these 3 gems. Now, though, let's examine some of the weirder cases that, similar to these ones, involved a kind of psychic prediction of some kind, but about something else, maybe something a bit weirder. 4th case. In 1857, in London, a man was walking on Lower Thames Street to conduct some business. His mind was occupied with thoroughly commonplace business matters. The traffic and the activity was as normal, and there was nothing to awaken any kind of fear in his mind. Then, when he was crossing Great Tower Street, he was suddenly seized with a mysterious panic. He was suddenly and inexplicably filled with dread that he might be attacked by a tiger. This ridiculous idea got hold of him and haunted him so powerfully that he broke into a terrified run, and he didn't stop until he was safely indoors. It was only the next morning that he read in the Times newspaper that, exactly at the moment he became frightened and only a mile from him, a tiger that was being transported in a cage had actually escaped and ran loose in the streets, injuring several people. Remember, odds of a tiger attack are never zero. Next, one evening, an English soldier was stationed in India, in the village of Dewas Kudaya. After a long day of marching, he was exhausted and was relaxing in camp. Lately, he had been thinking of a young woman he had loved deeply and was devoted to for many years, but had lost touch with. The torture of such thoughts, and the barking of dogs, and baying of jackals prevented sleep. Suddenly, his tent door flew open and he saw the face and figure of the woman he was longing for. She looked older and inexpressibly sad, but it was undoubtedly her. She was dressed in a white lace dress that shone in the moonlight. She stretched her arms out to him and with a low plaintive cry said, "Do not let me go! Do not let me go!" He sprang forward, but she receded back into the darkness, although her words could still be heard sadly repeating, "Do not let me go." He ran like a madman in his underclothes through the camp, looking for her, but she could not be found. Later, he wrote to his father inquiring if he still had any hope with the young lady, but he wrote back saying, "Too late, my dear son. On the very day of the vision you described to me, she was married." This poor young soldier was so affected by this unquestionably heart-wrenching experience that he could never bring himself to marry. 6th case is about a historical tragedy. At the time they were building the underground Thames Tunnel, there was a headmaster of the Leicestershire Grammar School at Leicester. One night, when he was in bed with his wife, he screamed in terror. She asked what had got into him, and he, in horror, said that he'd seen the Thames Tunnel break through, that the workmen rushed to the staircases or ladders, the means of exit, but one poor fellow was overtaken by the rush of water and perished. Feeling he'd witnessed a true event, he was shaken and distraught. So much so, he begged his wife not to sleep, but to talk to him until dawn. She kept telling him it was just a dream, but he insisted it was as real as could be. That same morning, they were visiting friends, and his host said, "You heard the sad news from London? The Thames Tunnel has broken in. All the people in the works escaped, except one poor fellow who was overwhelmed. The couple asked if he was joking, but when they realized he was sincere, he told the entire company of people what he had dreamt and how it had left his shaken ever since. Though corroborated for time and details, and so worthy of mention in the book, most of the cases so far could only be considered single-witness paranormal events, and so they were put in the highest category of credible cases by the ever-rational SPR team. So, now, let's examine a few of those highest category cases. The cases that were either deemed entirely credible by these Victorian scientists and intellectuals, either because of many witnesses, or because of timing and corroboration by many witnesses, that simply can't be dismissed offhand. They also happen to be, maybe, the most interesting ones of all. First off, our seventh case. A man and his wife were lying in bed one night, getting ready to sleep. They had a night light burning on the mantel of their fireplace. Suddenly, the man became aware of a draped figure passing across the foot of the bed towards the fireplace. The specter seemed to stretch its hands out towards the nightlight. His wife, clearly seeing it now, grabbed his arm, and at that moment, the light went out. Thinking it was an intruder, the man immediately jumped out of bed and chased the figure, which ran out of the room. However, he found all doors and windows locked from the inside, and nobody in the house. When he got back to his terrified wife, she told him she also saw the specter, who had put out the night light with his outstretched hand before fleeing swiftly from the room. They never solved this mystery. Eighth, in 1845, a young woman was sharing a bed with a younger female relative when she suddenly felt a weight on her chest and, in panic, she felt as if she was suffocating. Opening her eyes, she was terrified to see a sinister veiled figure bending over her, as if making her its prey. At that moment, she felt the arm of her young relative wrap around her. After a minute or so of this, the veiled figure vanished, and she heard her young relative whisper, "Oh, Lizzie, I thought it was going to take you away." Later, the young relative said that she had also suddenly felt an oppressiveness in the room and woke up to see the sinister veiled figure leaning over her relative, Lizzie, in bed. She threw her arm around her because she was suddenly seized with a fear that it had come to take her away from them. Apparently, the family moved out of that house soon afterwards. Yeah, no wonder. Next one isn't a collective case, but it has a king in it, so. A certain Colonel Thompson was in Brussels, talking to the king of the Belgians, no less. The king was giving him some instructions concerning the volunteers he had brought with him. As he was concentrating on the king's directions, somebody leaned in and spoke in his ear, saying, "Your brother wants you." He told him that he was engaged with the king, obviously, I would have added, and it's impossible to leave him. He looked around but saw nobody near him. He saw a volunteer standing nearby and assumed it was him. He then went back to his important king-related tasks. As soon as he was free, he inquired everywhere to ask who had interrupted him while he was talking to the king, but everyone denied it was them. In fact, the guards on duty denied anyone had even come into the room. Only days later was he informed that his brother had died at around the same time those words had been spoken into his ear. Here's maybe the first scientifically documented ghost that solved a murder. A man named William Eden was found dead on the road near Aylesbury, with several ribs broken. The attention of the police eventually came to a man named Tyler, and he was brought before the court. He had come to the attention of police because the wife of the murdered man said that when she was ironing a shirt on the Saturday night her husband was murdered, something came over her and she thought her husband was near. She looked up and thought she heard the voice of her husband come from nearby. As she turned from her ironing, she ran out and said, "Oh, dear God, my husband is murdered and his ribs are broken." She told this to several of her neighbors. She thought she saw her husband's apparition in the man that had killed him too, and that man was Tyler. She had even seen her husband holding his ribs and Tyler with his hammer in hand, which witnesses told Tyler used effectively as a weapon. On her psychic tip, as well as the corroborating circumstantial evidence that was later found to confirm her story, Tyler and his accomplice were condemned and executed. Our 11th and last one. A captain of Her Majesty's regiments had long loved a young lady and gave her pressing attentions, always showing his devotion. One day, sadly, when this passionate horseman was racing, he was thrown from his horse, breaking his leg. Since then, he always walked with a limp. However, this didn't dampen his passionate attentions to his love. He continued to teach her to ride and waltz with her gracefully, every time there was a ball, despite his limp. At last, he insisted she give him an answer about their future together. They agreed that if she attended his next race, wearing a rose, and after the race gave to him this rose, it would be her answer. She did wear her rose. It was a beautiful day for both of them. He won his race, her rose, and her acceptance. The girl's mother gave a dance in celebration, set for that evening. The ball began, yet the captain didn't arrive. They had intended to waltz together, but when the first waltz started, he wasn't there. Annoyed, the girl and her mother wondered what could have happened. At last, they both saw her captain walk in, but dressed in his usual military uniform instead of the full formal attire that was usual at balls. He did have her rose in his lapel. The captain had a serious look on his face and walked up to look at her. Without a word, he kept his eyes fixed on her in loving devotion for a time, and then turned and walked back out of the hall with his usual limp and staring at her with seriousness and devotion the whole time. When the waltz resumed, he never came back, and the girl and her mother were perplexed. She looked for her captain everywhere, but nobody had seen him. The next morning, as the girl and her mother were having breakfast, her father rushed in looking anxious and alarmed. "Did you not say Captain was here last night? You saw him?" They both confirmed that he had come briefly and then left. The father continued, "He has not been in barracks all night. He rode out towards the bridge to a farm about 5 p.m. His horse came back about midnight, saddle soaked and horse terrified. Of course, the whole garrison turned out and a general search was made. He was not found until the second day, in the river. He had put on his military uniform before starting, intending to return late for mess. Her rose was still in his lapel and it was buried with him. He came home, or intended doing so, by a deep ford, but the river had risen suddenly. He tried no doubt to swim the river, but did not succeed. They think the horse got spooked and knocked him on the forehead, as there was a mark. His watch had stopped at about 10:15 p.m. The ball began at 9 p.m. He came to keep his engagement and to have his last long look at the woman he loved, with a love that even death could not stop. There you have it, the meticulously selected cream of the crop, from the casebook of the early years of the SPR, who themselves meticulously selected the paranormal happenings from Victorian England and beyond, selecting only what could be called the scientifically credible cream of the crop. Can't get much creamier than that. The Victorian era's meticulously documented ghost stories and investigations laid the groundwork for contemporary studies of the paranormal. And they've left a lasting legacy that continues to captivate and intrigue. Not to mention a few good ghost stories that continue to raise a few goosebumps. Wouldn't you say? That just about wraps up tonight's tale from Lorehound. Follow us as we sniff out more of history's most interesting stories.
As the hound dog entered the dimly lit library, he sensed an aura of mystery surrounding the ancient scrolls. The dusty shelves towered above him as he sniffed his way through the labyrinth of books. Suddenly, he picked up a scent and followed it to a secluded corner. With bated breath, he approached the shelf and pawed at the book, revealing the hidden scroll. As he rolled it out, he knew he had discovered a treasure worth protecting at all costs.